Good afternoon, good evening, and welcome. This is a module on education markets, and it's module number 9 in the course that you're attending as part of the RISE lecture series on education. And it's based on research conducted as part of the LEAPS project, which I'll talk about. And this was developed by me, Tahir Andrabi, who's at Pomona College, and Asim Khwaja, who is at Harvard University. My name is Jishnu Das, and I'm a professor at Georgetown University, also a research associate at NBER, and a senior visiting fellow at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi. I should also emphasize that this lecture will cover a bunch of papers that we have written jointly with other people, including Natalie Bao, and I'll talk a little bit about a paper that we have ongoing with Noreen Karachiwala, who's at IFPRI. Well, without further ado, how exactly are we going to think about what we call education markets? Well, before we get there, let's think about some preliminaries for the format of the slides. This is a long presentation, so I want you to have it in the background and think about it. There are additional slides you can work through. And one particular set of slides are marked with 2 asterisks. These are technical slides, and you can use them as reference or return to them at your leisure. This is a version from August 4th, 2022, and I will update this when papers become available so that you have hyperlinks that you can follow up on. These will be available. We are developing a website for the LEAPS, the Learning and Educational Achievement in Pakistan Schools website. It'll be in the teaching section, and the website is leaps.hks.harvard.edu. It should be up by end of September. Please do visit it. It'll have all the data. It'll have a lot of papers and a lot of wonderful stuff for you to access. At that time, you will also have access to papers discussed in the slides, and you can download data and additional instructional resources. I will hyperlink in the presentation to papers that are already available and update them as they become available in the future as well. So here's what we're going to cover in this lecture. First, many children in low-income countries now live in settings with substantial school choice. And I'll show you what that means when we come to it. We're going to call these education markets. Okay? This means that parents and children choose what schools to go to. So imagine there are many schools in your village, many schools in your city. You have to choose which school you want to go to. And schools in turn are going to respond to that parental demand. Right? So if you're a school and you realize that parents want something from you or something from the school, you are going to respond to that both in what you offer and at what price. If they can charge fees. I mean, if you're a private school, for instance, and you can charge fees, that will determine your fees. So what we're going to look at in this lecture is 3 parts. Part 2 will discuss what this environment looks like in terms of schooling options. Part 3 will show how this lens of education markets will change everything we think about key policy and research questions. But before we go there, I want to put one corrective, which I call part 1, which is I want you to think a little broader about education in low-income countries. And within that, I want to place part 2 and part 3. Okay, so let's start with part 1. And then we'll take a little bit of a break and then come back to part 2. We'll take a bit of a break and come back to part 3. Okay, so here's part 1, the view from 30,000 feet. Okay, let me read you a little bit of a paragraph. 25 million blank adults, right? Blank here is the name of a country, cannot read the poison warnings on a can of pesticide, a letter from their child's teacher, or the front page of a daily paper. An additional 35 million read only at a level less than equal to the full survival needs of our society. Together, these 60 million people represent more than 1/3 of the entire adult population. The question is, what country is this? What is that blank? And the answer, of course, is it's the US. right? So this is Jonathan Kozel, a writer whose work I strongly kind of suggest you read. He has just these amazing books on education that make you rethink your own positions and what we are seeing around the world. This one is from a book that he wrote in 1985 called Illiterate America, right? And if you look for adult illiteracy on Wikipedia or something, you'll see the situation's not very different today, right? So sizable fractions of the population in the US cannot read and or do basic math required to function in society, right? And this is something that's true for countries around the world, right? So although countries are reforming constantly and spending more money on education, quality of schooling itself has been very hard to improve. And what I want to emphasize, because maybe in other units you have heard about how low-income countries are way behind, are not doing well, I want to emphasize that low-income countries have done exceptionally well compared to today's high-income countries and have recovered in an amazingly short time from the entire destruction of the schooling systems under colonial regimes. So let me show you some of these numbers because I find them very interesting and they change kind of how we think about education in these countries. So, there's a wonderful paper by Michael Clemens, who's at the Center for Global Development, and it's hyperlinked. Whenever you see something blue, that means you can just click on it and it will take you to the paper. He has investigated the historical experience of enrollment increases around the world. And I wanted to thank my colleague, Professor James Habyarimana, for this reference. And here's the picture that he's put through, right? So 0 in this picture is the year in which a country achieved 50% primary enrollment, right? Which means that roughly 30% of children under 15 are enrolled in school. Remember, children 1 to 5 are not typically enrolled in school, right? And then what he's drawn is, look, I mean, how many years does it take to get to that 50%, and then from 50% higher up, how much gain do you actually make, right? So for example, if you look at this global, what he calls this global increase in education in Michael's paper, what you find, for example, is if you start off at 50, give me 1 second, please, sorry. If you start off at 50 and you are going up, here's 50, and it's going to take you about 100 years to get 60% of the children in under 50 enrolled in school. Again, 1 to 5 kids are not going to school necessarily, or they're in preschool, so that's pretty much full enrollment. It's going to take you about 100 years from that point. So here are some numbers. From 50% to 70%, it takes about 22 years. It took around 22 years for the high-income countries. From 70% to 80%, about 36 years. And from 80 to 90, about 58 years. Right? How are low-income countries doing? Let's look at Burkina Faso. And I picked Burkina Faso because it's an example of a country that people think is not doing very well. So it was a country that was severely off track to meet what were called the MDG, the Millennium Development Goal targets. It was 36% net enrollment in 2000, and the expected enrollment in 2015 was 59%. In fact, if it were growing at the 19th century transition rate, we should have expected 45.4% in 2015. At the post-1950 rate, 49.4%. What do we actually see? 69% in 2015, 78% in 2018. So in a way, Burkina Faso, a country that people thought was severely off track, has far exceeded any historical analog that we have in terms of how fast it's been able to increase its enrollment. Here's a second example from a paper that I think is exceptional and you should have a look at. This improvement is even more remarkable when we realize that many countries received their independence from colonial rule only in the last 70 years. And once they did, they invested heavily in education. So this paper, Prashant Bharadwaj and Karen Greppin have an amazing paper from Zimbabwe, which gains independence in 1980. right? And what they've tried to draw here was, look, here's your age in 1980. So these are 14 to 15-year-olds who are going to become eligible for secondary school, right? And you can see that before that, people who were too old to go to secondary school. So think about, this is what was happening to children before independence. Only about 45% of them, they have only about 5.5 years of schooling, right? But immediately the children born just as independence hits, they have 7 years of schooling, right? And that gap, obviously, if they remove the children who were exactly 14 or 15, which is this graph here, you can see this so clearly, right? I mean, children who were born before independence had 5 years of schooling. Children born after had 7.5, right? So what did Zimbabwe really need? Zimbabwe needed freedom, right? It was the colonial regime that was holding back years of schooling, not the country itself, right? I want to give you a third example, which is India. And historians have assembled data for the Madras presidency in India, and their best estimates suggest that the presidency was more illiterate in 1930 than it used to be in 1820, 110 years of wastage, right? So in 1825, the state of education in Madras was significantly better than England in 1800. So the historian Dharampal, he writes in The Beautiful Tree, what happened, right? And the main point, and what the Indians are interested, the Indian historians are now interested in trying to understand, was what exactly happened after the British came, and why is it that the education collapsed completely? And the answer seems to be that the British interests, as Dharampal writes, were largely mercantile, technological, or were concerned with comprehending and evaluating Indian statecraft. Right? Indian religions, philosophies, scholarship, extent of education had scarcely interested them until then. Right? And they're trying to figure out why that is. And he basically says, look, the British had very little tradition of education at the time they came to India. Right? In matters like religion, philosophy, learning, and education, the British were introverted by nature. He's not saying that there was no education in Britain. It's that it was very, very limited to a very select elite. Right? So so now the whole pattern reverses. We start thinking about a place that's highly educated, India, the British, who are largely uneducated, coming to India, seeing something totally different and not being able to understand it at all, right? So after independence, India now had to remake an education system that had actually been significantly undermined in the previous 150 years, right? So what you see from 1947, when India gets its independence onwards, is not starting from something. It's starting from a massive destruction over 200 years, right? So what's the situation today? This is a story you might have heard in a lot of your previous units. Enrollment has increased, but learning is lagging behind. And I want to stress the fact that children have problems with reading and math does not mean that all children are doing equally poorly. And I'm going to lean a lot on the long-term work that I've been doing in Pakistan. So let me start you off on that by showing you a graph with just a histogram of test scores among young adults aged 21 to 26. Right? While there's some young adults who are indeed doing poorly, so this whole group here cannot count or read the alphabet. And you have to realize that that's a really problematic, big problem. But it's also something that is, it's there in the US as well. There are lots of people who cannot read as adults, right? On the other side, there are others who are doing significantly better. So these are children who can do complex fractions, read passages, answer questions. And what makes the leaps, quite interesting is it's all rural. So we are comparing, children within rural areas, not children who are in rural versus urban areas going to very different schools. We find exactly the same patterns, by the way, for functional skills like buying vegetables, paying electricity bills, or reading text messages. And when you glance through these slides, the next slide is exactly these questions we have asked and how much people can answer. And then the question is, what's driving this variation? Well, it's a complicated question. We have one answer, which is schooling, right? So if I plot here the years of schooling that a child has and plot over here their test scores, what you find very clearly is that there's a gradient, right? Children who have no schooling are about -2 standard deviations on their test scores. Children who have gone to college are at about +2. Right? The same pattern for life skills, except that you see it kind of, flattens out from about, beginning college onwards. Right? So, is this just because the people who are better are going on to college? Well, we say, no, it's not. It's not that, that's what's going on. And it's not that the correlation reflects that children would have learned this naturally as they age. So I have a paper with Natalie Bao and Andres E. Cheng, where we look at the LEAPS data and we show that if you compare children who dropped out and children who didn't, here's the children who didn't drop out. So here's what they get in class 3-4, in grade 3-4, and you shouldn't worry about these negatives and positives. These are in standard deviation terms. What you see is they're learning and they continue learning. But here in the blue are the dropouts, right? And what's happening with the dropouts? Well, the dropouts are learning, and when do they drop out? Well, they drop out in 2005. So what you see is, well, they're doing a little worse than the kids who continue on in 2005, but in fact, they seem to be learning just as much, right? So this line is parallel to this line. And again, from grade 4 to 5, they seem to be learning just as much. But then the moment they drop out, their learning stops, right? That's not, it's not a slam dunk, what they call slam dunk in the US for the case that this is not selection. You would need a randomized study or something of that sort, but it comes very close. I mean, we are showing that the patterns were identical before dropout. After dropout is when they diverged. So it's very likely that schooling is what's causing this learning, right? In fact, the tremendous concern over school closures under COVID-19 and the increasing evidence that children have learned, have really suffered in terms of their learning, confirms that children must be learning something in school, right? So let me summarize there. So in South Asia, a functioning school system was effectively destroyed by the British. Historians argue that this could be because at the time of colonization, the British were relatively uneducated and unable to appreciate complex texts and discussions. This schooling system, interestingly, was heavily dependent on local financing instead of a centralized state system. Since independence, low-income countries, including those in South Asia, have rapidly increased enrollment at a faster rate than what high-income countries had managed to do. And in many cases, enrollments improved as soon as countries gained independence. Right? Although test scores in our schooling systems are lower than those in high-income countries, children learn with every year of schooling. Right? But a key observation is that our schooling systems result in massive variation in learning. And this is what we will look up next. Parts 2 and 3 will examine this variation in greater detail. This is the first part of understanding how schooling systems can be improved. Again, I don't think, I would be the first to argue that our schooling systems face massive problems. I feel that this historical kind of perspective tells you and places those problems in context of kind of a broad sweep of what's been going on. And once you look at that broad sweep, it's pretty clear that low-income countries have done very well, and now we are addressing and starting to think about these next steps. Okay, so this is a good time for you to ask questions with your instructor, have a discussion, and when you come back, we are going to start with schooling markets. We're going to start with something called school value added. I will present to you a small model of strategic quality investments, and then we'll do some implications of the model. You'll see that, I won't have time to take you through detail on a lot of this material. Maybe the slides will help you get into them further. I will point you to resources that are available, and you can use them as you feel necessary.